Hi, and welcome to the 37th installment of the Dad Project. Tonight, having already looked at the Jet Age and the Atomic Age, we will be delving into the Space Age, or at least my take on it. Before we get to that, however, I'd like to apologize to anyone who's been wondering where I've been over the last few months. It seems that some of my original parts are beginning to wear out. So, like Steve Austin, I've begun to replace those parts. This time around was a total knee replacement. And like anyone who proudly holds his man card, I was sure I would be the miracle patient. No fuss, no muss. Unfortunately, that would not be the case. Between the drugs and the pain, there has been very little time or energy for any creative endeavors. And fair warning, this is a revised version of Installment 8 about the space program. I've since gotten my dad's files with his application for the space program, and I've been able to revise that installment with this information and a bit more. And with that, I'm back, and without further ado, let's proceed. It's hard to explain how all-encompassing the space program was to baby boomers, to those that view the moon landing as history, something to be read about. The Mercury 7 were national heroes before any of them got off the ground. The first few launches of each program, Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo, were must-see TV and were followed from launch to splashdown on TV, in the newspapers, and over the radio. Walter Cronkite, CBS's news anchor, was enthralled by the space program, and he was able to pass along his infectious wonder and awe to his millions of viewers. His coverage of the moon landing, professionally and expertly presented, would break along with the millions of others when he removed his glasses, wiped away a tear, and this normally eloquent man was speechless when Neil Armstrong announced the safe landing of the LEM on the moon. He said later, "I had as much time to prepare for that moon landing as NASA did, and I still was speechless when it happened. It just was so awe-inspiring to actually be able to see the thing through the television that was a miracle in itself." This would be the acme of the space age. Many would argue that the space age and the space race have a definitive starting date, the launch of Sputnik, but I would argue that it's not a start but one more layer of fear added to the public's already heightened anxiety and perception of the Soviets' power and determination. More on that later, but first we'll take a look at some of the intricacies of the space age. And before we go there, let's listen to Orson Welles recite John Gillespie's High Flight.
Oh, I have slipped the surly bonds of earth and danced the skies on laughter's silvered wings. Sunward I've climbed and joined the tumbling mirth of sun-split clouds and done 100 things you have not dreamed of. Wheeled and soared and swung high in the sunlit silence. Hovering there, I've chased the shouting wind along and flung my eager craft through footless halls of air. Up the long, delirious, burning blue, I've topped the windswept heights with easy grace, where never lark or even eagle flew. And while with silent, lifting mind I've trod the high, untrespassed sanctity of space, put out my hand and touch the face of God.
Sputnik's launch in October of 1957, with its constant beeping as it made its way around the globe, is considered the starting pistol that marked the beginning of the space age and finished the heat of the space race. The shock of Sputnik to the American public cannot be understated, nor underestimated. The Atomic Age, which we reviewed in the previous installment, was in its nascent phase, and that distinctive beep, beep, beep was another shot literally heard around the globe. No matter what the United States did to move its space program forward in this period, the Soviets were one step ahead. Was it espionage? Was it subterfuge? Was the US that inferior? Perhaps, but what both the United States and the Soviet Union had were hundreds of former Nazi scientists who had been responsible for the German rockets, aircraft, and munitions during World War II. Even before World War II's bloody conclusion, both the Soviets and Allies were planning for the capture of these scientists and relocating them to their respective countries. The U.S. program, called Operation Paperclip, operated from 1945 to 1959 and would bring over 1,600 scientists to the U.S., and any Nazi Party affiliations would be glossed over. A similar Soviet program, called Operation Osav Yakim, would bring over 2,500 former German scientists into Russia. Both the Soviets and the US had been developing rockets before the war, but the Germans were well advanced. Their development of the V-1 buzz bomb and the V-2 rocket during the war culminated with the launching of thousands of V-1s and V-2s beginning in 1944. Most of these rockets were aimed at Great Britain. The V-1 was the precursor of the modern cruise missile, and the V-2 the precursor of the ballistic missile. For its part, the Soviets were well advanced with their own rocket programs in the 20s and 30s. But like most Soviet intelligentsia, their ranks were decimated by Stalin's Great Purge that lasted from 1936 through 1938. Two leading Soviet aerospace engineers who had been at the forefront of early Soviet rocket programs before the Purge, Valentin Glushko and Sergei Korolev, were released from the gulags in 1944 when Stalin realized the potential of the German V-1 and V-2 rockets. Korolev would go on to lead the Soviets' unsuccessful manned lunar program. The U.S. had been developing its own rockets with Robert Goddard at the forefront, but it would be the surrender of Wernher von Braun and about 100 rocket scientists through Operation Paperclip that would set the U.S. on the course to the moon. Von Braun would be intimately involved in the development of the American space program until his retirement in 1972. Along with personnel, the U.S. had also captured 300 rail car loads of V-2s and parts that were shipped to the United States for study and development. These men and the captured rockets would be the basis for all future American rocket development. The Soviets, on the other hand, initially located their rocket development program and testing in Germany to use former German manufacturing and personnel to develop their own V-2s. Then, without notice, the entire operation and the German staff were moved to a secret research bureau in central Russia. This being the secret city approach the Soviets would use for most of their most critical and sensitive military and space programs from then on. While von Braun was very much a public face for NASA, the Soviets downplayed the German involvement in their programs. But that being said, it is hard to determine how well the American or Soviet space programs would have succeeded without the infusion of these former Nazis. For all intents and purposes, this was the beginning of the space race. They just didn't know where the finish line was. For a little boy awakening in the mid-60s, this would be information to be discovered years later. What I was part of was a space-mad populace ready for anything that had to do with the space program. In September of 1965, one of those Triton treacle outlets, the NBC show I Dream of Jeannie, premiered. It would be 5 years of the silly adventures of Captain Tony Nelson, played by Larry Hagman, and Jeannie, played by Barbara Eden, in a mythical town named Cocoa Beach in a mythical state called Florida. For a 7-year-old boy, my focus was on Tony, an astronaut, a guy that reminded me of my dad. Another favorite was My Favorite Martian with Ray Walston as Uncle Martin and Bill Bixby as Tim O'Hara. Obviously playing on the eternal question, are we alone in this universe? And answering with the typical response, yes, but the aliens will have to have at least one cranial protuberance that lets us know that, indeed, they are alien. 1965 also heralded the premiere of Lost in Space, a modern retelling of the Swiss Family Robinson. The modern Robinson family launches into space aboard the Jupiter 2, headed for Alpha Centauri. The planned expedition would be derailed by the diabolical Dr. Smith that would send the Jupiter 2 hurtling through space to unknown worlds. The initial seriousness of the show would itself be derailed by the popularity of Dr. Smith and a dwindling budget that diminished the production values to comical levels. But for this little boy, it was must-see TV. There were many more science fiction, fantasy television shows that were spawned in this time period, but in 1966, the mother of all science fiction shows and franchises debuted, Star Trek. This space western immediately captivated me, and fortunately for me, it also captivated my grandmother. I'm not sure if she was big into science fiction, but she may have had a crush on William Shatner. In any case, no matter the reason, I was allowed to watch Star Trek with her at times well past my bedtime, 8:30 to 9:30 on Fridays, when it first aired, until its doomsday slot at 10 to 11 on Friday in its final season. For a little boy, most of these mature themes probably went right over my head, and just to be sure, I was also taking in a heavy dose of shows like The Monkees and Batman that would scramble any higher-level thinking that may have squeaked by while watching Star Trek. In the background of this silliness was the real space program. On May 5, 1961, Alan Shepard made a 15-minute and 28-second flight in the Freedom 7 to become the first American in space. My father would be aboard the Lake Champlain to greet him as the boat's helicopters dropped swimmers next to the bobbing Mercury capsule, helped load Shepard into a harness, and lifted him to the helicopter and back to the boat. On May 25, 1961, only 20 days after Shepard had been lobbed into space, President John F. Kennedy delivered an address to a joint session of Congress where he said,
"I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal, before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth."
This bold, stunning, and chilling goal, delivered soon after Shepard's flight, came 2 months before NASA even managed to lob our second astronaut, Gus Grissom, on his suborbital flight on Liberty Bell 7 on July 21st. To further solidify what he had said to Congress, Kennedy would deliver a speech at Rice University in Houston, Texas, where he is best remembered for these words.
"We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard."
This 18-minute speech, written mostly by Kennedy's speechwriter Ted Sorensen, in all its eloquence would light a fire under the American public, the space program, and double down on landing a man on the moon. What made this speech that much more amazing is that there had only been 8 successful space flights, 4 Soviet and 4 American, before the speech was delivered. Of those 8, it would be Yuri Gagarin's flight on the Vostok 1, the first man in space, that in April 1961 that would, like Sputnik, cause the most consternation in the United States and put the American space program on its heels. More importantly, it would turn the space race into a sprint. Kennedy's address to Congress and speech at Rice University put the American space program in an all-or-nothing position. It was a goal that could not be ignored. A less understood result of that speech was the dichotomous parallel paths that would define the 60s. On the one hand was a high-minded, very difficult goal of landing a man on the moon. On the other was the expansion of American involvement in Southeast Asia and the military conflict that went with it. My father would spend time on both paths, but for this conversation we will stick with his chance to be an astronaut. His experiences in Vietnam are covered in installments 10 through 13. So, unbeknownst to me, while I was watching silly space-related TV shows and downing Tang as fast as I could make it, my dad was applying to NASA to become a member of Astronaut Group 5. The application deadline for Astronaut Group 5 was midnight December 1st, 1965, my dad's 31st birthday. Prior to this deadline, the Project Mercury program had run its course, having been launched atop a Mercury Redstone rocket, a modified Army medium-range ballistic missile, before graduating to the Mercury Atlas rocket for the ride that made John Glenn a national hero. More improbable was that JFK's moon speech had been delivered soon after Shepard's suborbital flight and several months before John Glenn's successful orbital flight. The audacity of this proclamation, that our space program would deliver a man to the moon and bring him home safely, is unprecedented. If not for our pathological fear of falling behind the Soviets even further, it never would have happened. And to that end, the Gemini program was in full swing as it set out to prove that astronauts could survive the extended stays in space, that the capsules could be maneuvered to meet with one another and with unmanned equipment, and dramatically, Ed White's spacewalk. Despite other Soviet firsts, it was the Gemini program where the Soviets began to falter. These were heady times for NASA, and by 1966 they were already looking beyond Project Apollo. But before that, Alan Shepard, then chief of the Astronaut Office, had created the Advanced Programs Office, the APC, within the Manned Spacecraft Center. Under the umbrella of the APC was the Apollo Applications Program that was established in September of 1965, and its agenda was nearly as audacious as JFK's speech. The Apollo Applications Program was projecting and planning for more than 45 crewed missions flown atop 19 Saturn V's and 26 Saturn 1B rockets. Additionally, there were plans for 3 orbital workshops, 3 orbital laboratories, and 4 Apollo telescope mounts. The beginning of this was predicated on a successful moon landing. Deke Slayton, the director of flight crew operations, anticipated needing another 24 astronauts for the Apollo Applications Program, on top of the 33 astronauts NASA already had. So, on September 10, 1965, NASA announced it would be accepting applications for Astronaut Group 5 by the already mentioned December 1st deadline. Soon thereafter, during the week of 25 October, a selection board of the Bureau of Naval Personnel was convened to review and screen those officers that had volunteered for astronaut training. My dad received a letter dated 12 November from the same bureau that outlined the paperwork necessary to apply to NASA for consideration for astronaut training. Buried in the letter is Item 2, which read, It is with pleasure to inform you that the board recommended your name be forwarded to the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA, for further consideration. And finally, item 6 finishes the letter with this. You are congratulated on your selection as one of the Navy's recommended candidates for possible participation in the NASA astronaut training program. Your interest in the nation's space effort is wholeheartedly endorsed. Military effusiveness at its best. This was akin to having $1 million lottery ticket in your pocket, and before the numbers were drawn, your chances were as good as the next guy. So, what pithy statement would my dad make as he orbited the Earth? Should he buy a parade-worthy suit? He already had a Corvette. Would they give him a new one? Oh my gosh, is this for real? Whoa, space cowboy, slow down. First, let's do the paperwork. About 5,000 other astronaut hopefuls had also answered the call for applications, so the chances for acceptance were not good. But on the face of it, the requirements are very straightforward. You had to be a U.S. citizen born after December 1st, 1929, less than 6 feet tall, with a bachelor's degree in the physical or biological sciences or engineering. All right, let's see. Born December 1st, 1934, in Cleveland, Ohio. U.S. citizen. Check. 5 feet 11 inches tall. Check. Engineering degree from the Naval Academy and extensive class time in aerodynamics while in test pilot school. Check. The main limiting factor on these early astronaut classes was the requirement for the applicant to be a graduate of the Armed Forces Test Pilot School and or 1,000 hours of jet flying experience. 1,000 hours of jet time. He had about half of that, and about 3,000 hours of total flight time upon application. But he was a graduate of the Naval Test Pilot School at Pax River, so check. And just to be sure you didn't take yourself too seriously, a Civil Service Form 57 application for federal employment was also required to bring the red tape full circle. The package also included a pro forma for the applicant's references. Pretty straightforward stuff except for one question that spoke to the still very public fascination with the space program. Number 9. Would he and his family be effective in meeting public relations requirements? To which one respondent replied, Lieutenant and Mrs. Purvis, Pete and Ann, both and separately possess a combination of poise and charm that would very effectively meet all public relations requirements. They are an attractive and well-liked couple with a harmonious and stable home environment. He failed to mention my dad's 2.5 children, me, my brother, and my little sister, which is too bad because I'm sure our photo-ready little faces would have swayed Alan Shepard, Deke Slayton, and the rest of the panel's decision-makers in my father's favor. Any dedicated follower of my installments, as well as anyone familiar with the space program, already knows there was no astronaut named Pete Purvis on NASA's roster. And although Deke Slayton did not accept the 24 candidates he had hoped for, he did surprise the selection committee when he accepted all 19 candidates that were rated as qualified. His selection also reflected the astronaut corps' higher than expected attrition rate and unexpected deaths. This was a group that would go on to man Apollo missions, Apollo-Soyuz flights, Space Lab flights, and a number of space shuttle missions. For all their success, however, what they couldn't overcome was a fickle public whose attention was wandering to other shiny objects, but even more so by the ever-deteriorating war in Vietnam. The program had originally been planned out to Apollo 20, but that mission was canceled even before the unfortunate flight of Apollo 13. Apollo missions 16 and 17 were very nearly canceled with the rest when President Nixon proposed canceling all the remaining lunar missions in August of 1971. This was a mere 2 years after the astonishing success of Apollo 11. Budget cuts, an unpopular war, and the fickle public no doubt went a long way to truncate the Apollo program. But what truly slowed or canceled these programs was the failure of the Soviet lunar programs. So what were the Soviets doing? A CIA military economic intelligence memorandum titled Comparison of U.S. and Estimated Soviet Expenditures for Space Programs and dated August 1964 begins with this conclusion. Soviet investment in space programs has been expensive but has paid handsome dividends in the form of a number of spectacular space accomplishments that created an image of military strength and technological superiority. Well-publicized Soviet space firsts and an official policy of concealing failures have imbued the Soviet space effort with an aura of virtually unblemished success, although well over 1/3 of all Soviet space attempts have ended in failure. The report goes on to say, Having used its space program to create an image of strategic capabilities and technological prowess, the USSR can ill afford to ignore the challenge offered by the U.S. manned lunar landing program. And concludes with this. In any event, the Soviet space program will be increasingly expensive, not only in aggregate monetary terms, but also in terms of the scarce human and material resources that are needed for the other high-priority military and civilian programs. The Soviets, in fact, did not ignore the U.S. manned lunar landing program, and indeed their resources were spread thin across several competing programs in hopes of achieving a manned lunar landing before the U.S. However, what spelled the doom of their lunar programs was the failure of the N-1 rocket system. This failure, including the success of the Apollo program and serious budget constraints, would lead the Soviets to secretly cancel their manned lunar program in 1976. Like many Soviet programs, their manned lunar program died silently. The national pride of their earlier space firsts was now deep in the shadows of the success of the American Apollo program. Despite this, it wouldn't be until 1974, with a secret government decree that removed the program's leader, Vasily Mishin, that effectively ended the program. Under different leadership, the program would limp along until, again secretly, the program was officially terminated in 1976, along with any further development of the N-1 rockets. Mishin would write years later about the N-1 and the L-3-L-1 projects, where he blamed underinvestment, only $4.5 billion compared to the Apollo's $24 billion, a lack of cooperation between design bureaus, as well as the poor management of the 500 enterprises and 26 government bureaus involved in the program. Most notably, he mentioned the Soviets' failure to grasp the significance of President Kennedy's challenge, as well as the extreme technical difficulties of sending humans to the moon. And just to put a bow on it, as Kennedy said, "We choose to go to the moon in this decade and to do other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard." So, with the Soviets' cancellation of their lunar program in 1976 and the cancellation of any further Apollo manned moon missions following the Apollo 17 mission in December of 1972, Space Age 1.0 was over. Astronaut Frank Borman would sum up the space race and the first space age like this. In my estimation, there were 3 Cold War battles. One was Korea, we tied it. One was Vietnam, we lost it. And one was the space program, and we won it. And I think that the demonstration of the American technology, American management capability, people overlook the fact that the management techniques that were developed in Apollo are extremely important to this country. So I think that the Apollo program was probably worth it for that reason alone. The thrill and wonder of the space program have been in my blood since I was old enough to understand what it was all about. When we returned to Virginia Beach from Europe in 1965, we drove down to Winter Park, Florida to pick up my sister, who had been with my grandmother, Mimi, while we were away. While there, we watched Gemini 5 launch in the distance with Gordon Cooper and Pete Conrad in the capsule. It was only the smoke trail, but I followed it until it was gone. Many of the things my father did as a pilot he considered mundane, routine. To me, they are much more than that, but the what if of being an astronaut, that's one that gives me pause. A truly dramatic arc that just wasn't meant to be. No hometown parade, no bargain rate Corvettes, no presidential phone calls or handshakes. Just didn't happen. My dad's astronaut dream ended almost as soon as it began, but I can only imagine what was going through my dad's head as he sent off his packet to Houston. It must have been thrilling. And so, we'll end it there. So until next time, when we look at my dad's dip into the civilian aircraft world, thanks for joining me for the 37th installment of the Dad Project. I continue to tell the stories I hope my father would tell me, and I appreciate y'all being along for the journey. So please subscribe if you'd like to hear more, and until next time, thanks for watching, and enjoy what life is giving you. Ciao.